processes.
Thanks, Robin, and thanks everybody for attending this morning. Again, apologies for the reschedule. That was my bad. So we are talking about security processes today and about how processes help you build out your program, and really where kind of the rubber meets the road. We've talked about governance and we've talked about policies. The processes are how you actually implement the policies and the governance that we talked about. So a little bit about me. I'm Paul. I'm one of the co-founders of TruShield. I've got about 17 years of experience in security. I'm more than happy to answer questions either during this session or via email or LinkedIn. We're pretty active on LinkedIn with respect to publishing threat research and different articles about cybersecurity, so I'd invite you to follow us there and connect with me on LinkedIn. Same thing goes for Twitter. Again, if you have questions about what we talked about today or anything else under the sun with respect to cyber, go ahead and reach out to me. A little bit about TruShield. So we're a global cybersecurity company. We are based in DC. We've got customers on 3 continents and operations throughout the world. We've split our business into a couple different areas: professional services and managed services. In professional services is where we do a lot of the security consulting and the kind of management consulting, which really is kind of what we're talking about today. We're trying to guide you guys on how to go about constructing a security program that's really going to be effective in terms of meeting your own requirements. And there's a roadmap to that. That is really established around 5 key areas. And for us, again, it all starts with governance. We talked about that in February, and we talked about how security needs to start at the very top of the organization and kind of flow down from there. We talked on March 23rd about policies, on how policies are how your security operation takes the lead from governance and kind of issues it out to the employee base, including things like enforcement and consequences when policies are not followed. So today we're going to talk about process, and process is really how you transition between policy and security controls. Controls are going to be talking about towards the end of May, and then we're going to follow up closing the program out with oversight and compliance, really how you're measuring to make sure that you're successful across every component of your security program. So how that all fits together in the construct of the security program, again, we start at the very top with governance. Governance flows down into policies, and then again, processes are kind of the bridge between the policy and the control. So really right in the middle of the program right now. So we're in the meat of the security program sandwich. So the agenda today, what we're going to talk about is what and why a process, really what is a good process, what does it need to do, how does it fit into an overall information security management program, how do we determine what a good process is, and kind of what are some of the key characteristics of a good process. So what are they, and why do you actually need them? Well, a process really is something that enables the security program. It's, again, how you take the requirements of either your regulation or your policy and figure out how to turn that around into a control in a manner that's going to be repeatable, sustainable, and scalable. And that's, I think, the key thing we're going to leave you with today is that there's a couple of key characteristics that processes have, and that's that repeatability, measurability, scalability, and sustainability. And the other thing to always bear in mind when we're talking about process is it's not just a single instance or kind of a one-time thing. A process, the good processes are lifecycle based. They're focused on continuous improvement, and they really help establish the different components of the security program. Our methodology is to break the security program into 4 key areas, which is what you see on the screen right now. And those four key areas for us are prevention, detection, containment, and then response and eradication. And there's process to each one of these different areas here. So each one of these puzzle pieces has several things that kind of make it up. And that includes the people or the roles that are responsible for that process area, and then the tools that support it, and then of course the process itself. To give you a couple of examples, so in the prevention area, you might have somebody like a firewall administrator. Their tools are really the firewall and the different things that are used to manage that firewall. And then a process which might support prevention is something like a regular rule set checkup for how that firewall is operated and whether or not those rules are continuously required and conform to configuration baselines and things like that. Other things that might fall into prevention include vulnerability scanning to ensure that you're keeping up with vulnerabilities within your environment. And again, you security professionals out in the audience, I'm sure you realize that vulnerability scanning is not a one-time thing. It's something that you need to continuously do, usually at least once a month. And it's not just the scan component of it that helps support that prevention bucket, but it's the remediation. And that's where we're talking about continuous improvement and repeatability and measurability. And again, those are kind of key characteristics of a good process. Within detection, there's a number of different things that kind of fall into that space. Things like a security monitoring analysis or analyst within your security operations center, for instance, might be watching things like your SIM or your IDS, and those are tools which support that process. And things that actually the process itself includes, things like false positive analysis, triaging of events, tuning of the SIM, things like that. And again, those are not just one-time activities. Those are continuously occurring in a good and repeatable process sort of format. Within containment, the different roles that might fall within containment for kind of our methodology are usually around things like network analysis or security architecture. Good security architecture goes a long way towards helping with containment strategies, and that really relies upon like network segmentation and things like that. So tools that you might find in that containment space include like, a good VLAN on a managed switch or a firewall that allows you to do good network segmentation. And a process that supports that might be a continuous architecture review or regular architecture checkups to ensure that you're conforming to best practices, things along those lines. In response and eradication, the roles that support that are people like incident handlers, and actually goes kind of hand in hand with the detection component. Obviously, as you kind of listen to me here, you're realizing all these things are interlinked. In response and eradication, certainly is reliant upon effectiveness of these other three categories. But the incident handler is going to use things like forensic analysis toolkits, perhaps an incident tracking tool, and the processes that support that aspect of it include again, that forensic analysis, the root cause analysis, perhaps hard drive analysis, things like that. And then, of course, the incident handling process itself, which is something that should be repeatable and lifecycle based so that you're actually learning lessons from the incidents that are occurring in your environment. And that's really an important part of it. It's lessons learned is always a part of a good process. And that's really supported by the fact that processes are lifecycle based. It's, again, not a one-time activity. It's something that you're continuously working through. So we produced an example here of the risk management process to kind of show you how the thought process works with respect to this. You start at the top. Of course, we need to identify the risks, and we need to assess and analyze what they actually mean to us, what's the impact that we could potentially have to our organization as a result of this particular risk. And then based upon that understanding of what it is that we're looking at, we're going to plan some kind of action. We're going to think about how can we overcome that specific risk. We're going to do things like a cost analysis against that impact, and we're going to hopefully implement countermeasures that will reduce the risk from occurring in the first place, and certainly something that could recover if the risk does actually come to fruition. And that's really where that implementation aspect of it is. So we're going to implement some control to prevent or mitigate a risk, and then we're going to need to measure it to make sure that it was actually successful. And that's super, super important when you're talking about process. Process needs to be measurable. Need to be able to look at it from, from an objective viewpoint and say whether or not the activity that we undertook, the control that we implemented, or the action that we took actually produced the result that we were looking for. And if it didn't, the fact that it's a continuous improvement lifecycle gives us the chance to course correct. And that course correction is really another important aspect of it, so that the lessons we learn from the first iteration make the second iteration better, and so on and so forth. A really important aspect of it. It's important to remember that security is not in and of itself the destination, but it's a very kind of a long journey to get to a truly secure system. And as again, you security professionals in the audience know, security, there's no perfect security out there. There's always some residual risk, and trying to manage down to minimizing that is really where we get better each time we go through the process, is how you actually do that. And that, again, continuous process improvement is what we're talking about here. So this is really an example of how to create the process. We want to assess what it is that we're trying to accomplish. We want to design some process that's got the right kind of checks and balances, the right kind of milestones, the ability to actually do the measurement, and identify some of those key performance indicators and metrics that we're going to actually track, and then go ahead and design that process around all that stuff, implement it. Implementing means training the people that are responsible for producing some component of that process, or that have to actually follow the checklist, for instance, or implementing the tools that support the process. There's many different aspects of it. It could be technology, or it could be behavior-based sort of process where an individual has to do something versus a technology doing something. And then, of course, observe what happens, evaluate whether or not it was successful, and continue to do that throughout the life cycle of that process, as long as it's applicable to the need. And then each time, again, you should be able to get better at doing what it is that we're trying to do. So really think about that when you're trying to design a process. And again, there's a few key characteristics that processes have. One of them is scalability. Scalability is really talking about, how can we apply the construct that we put in place to support this one need to a bigger problem, or to, the next step. Is the next iteration of this process going to apply to a larger set of data, or perhaps, greater customer base, or things along those lines? And it needs to be scalable. It needs to be able to kind of grow with you as your organization grows. Most organizations are dynamic and changing, and processes actually need to support that kind of dynamic and changing environment. And that's an important thing to kind of think about as well, is that as your company grows, your problems are going to grow as well. And that's something we certainly experienced on our end. As our company has grown, we've had to produce these scalable processes to actually support many more clients in our managed services sort of environment, and think about how we can make processes repeatable and apply to a larger set of issues. And it's something to really think about. Scalability really comes through efficiency and through documenting steps within your checklist-based processes. Very good documentation, very good training, and repeatability are all part of being scalable. Additionally, processes need to be sustainable. They need to be able to withstand the test of time. Understanding that, of course, your environment's dynamic, the problems that you're going to face tomorrow might not be the same as they are today, but one way or another, the process shouldn't necessarily have to change to absorb those kind of road speed bumps. And those should be overcomable by a good process that has the right sort of controls that have been thought through, the right sort of KPIs and metrics that we're tracking and measuring, and should be able to survive change within the environment. Maybe a different firewall is put in place, but the firewall administration process should be largely the same. Maybe the types of activities that you use to harden a server are different. The different configurable items might change, but the process of actually performing the hardening is probably the same. Perhaps you might have a malware outbreak today that's different from the malware outbreak you saw yesterday, but your incident handling process is probably pretty similar, and it should be to support that sort of need. Kind of doesn't matter what it is you're looking at. You should be able to design a process that can account for multiple different variables. So again, that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel each time, because that's really where you lose all that efficiency that you're trying to build into this whole construct of a process. And that's a very important thing to remember. And again, kind of how you do that is through measurements. We want to make sure that what it is that we're implementing, we can actually track success, and we can actually see whether or not the effort we're putting into these lifecycle iterations are producing the results that we want. So things that you can think about in terms of measuring success, I'll give you a couple of examples. And actually, I'll also refer you back to a webinar that we did a while back that covers metrics and measurements and KPIs. If you're interested in that, take a look at our resource center where you'll find that webinar about executive measures and measurements. So some of the things that we like to measure are things like counts of vulnerabilities. If you have a good vulnerability management process, you should see trend lines declining in terms of counts of vulnerabilities over time, because you're going to get better and better at patching and identifying vulnerabilities as time goes on. Other ones that are interesting that we like to track are the amount of time it takes to detect an incident. That really is a good indicator of how good your detection process is. And process, of course, is the joining of people and technology together. And so, for detection time specifically, your people have to be well trained, and your tools have to be well configured, and there's a whole lexicon that goes into actually producing something that is sustainable in those regards. So it's a good thing to track there. Other ones that we like to track are the number of incidents across any one client in our managed services space. We'd like to see those declining over time too, simply because we're trying to give feedback to our clients so that they can continuously improve their security program, and you should hopefully, as a result of that, see a decline in total number of security incidents over time. Now, the question that begs is, but what if they're simply attacked more, or if you see more attacks over time for that one specific client? Perhaps they're higher profile tomorrow than they were yesterday, and they get hit by a bunch of DDoS attacks. And that's kind of the outlier case. And you should be able to identify things like that, spikes within the measures and metrics that you're taking. And that should be identifiable, not necessarily going to require a process change, because again, process should kind of stand the test of time. But you need to be able to take a pulse check on process so that you can ensure that the effort that you're putting into it is actually producing meaningful results. If you have a bunch of process and you're not measuring how well you're doing on them, then you're kind of throwing darts blindfolded because you're not sure whether or not you're truly producing the results that you're trying to foster through the process. So that's certainly something that you can take away from this, is that make sure you're measuring success of your process by figuring out what's the key performance indicator that's going to tell you whether or not it's actually producing the results that you're looking for. And again, I invite you to take a look at that Measures and Metrics webinar to give you some more ideas on how you can measure success of your security program. So information security management is really the process that you're going to use to manage your security here. And there's a number of components that go into information security management process. And I want to talk a little bit about each of these things. So we're going to give you some examples of process that supports each of these areas. But first, at a really high level, what we consider to be kind of key things within information security management are, first off, the design and implementation of security controls. And there's a bunch of work that goes into actually doing that. We'll talk a little bit about it. Of course, also security testing. I imagine most of you guys are familiar with vulnerability assessments and penetration testing. There's also security control testing, which is a component of that as well. We'll talk about that. Security incident handling. You know, our security mantra is that it's impossible to be perfect. You can't rely entirely on prevention to stop all incidents from occurring, and you need to be ready for when they do occur, because it truly is it's a when, not if sort of thing. So that security incident handling process needs to be pretty well thought out with an incident response plan, an incident response process, et cetera. And then lastly here is that security control and posture review. Thinking about situational awareness, thinking about, again, how well our security controls are architected, and that's really kind of the lessons learned component of this whole thing is again, taking measurements and learning from what it is that we've done right and what it is we've done wrong. So first, we're going to talk about design and implementation of security controls here. So first off, you got to think about what's the strategy. What are we actually trying to accomplish here? There are many different types of problems you're going to try to solve with security controls. You know, just thinking of a couple here, access control is usually an area where a lot of thought goes into how do we do things like multi-factor authentication. How do we do remote access and VPN and mobile device access and things like that? So you got to think of, first off, what's our strategy for overcoming this sort of thing? How much risk are we willing to accept as an organization, and how much do we have to mitigate that down? And that's really going to help you derive what the objective of that control is and kind of what sort of constraints you're going to put on yourself in terms of how much budget you're going to apply to it, how much time, how many resources from a personnel standpoint, and truly how rigorous that security control actually needs to be. With that in mind, you kind of have that strategy, you have the concept, then it's time to go and actually implement, or I'm sorry, design the control. So that could be, again, let's take the multi-factor example. That could be either a PIV card, or within the government, that's a an identification card you plug into your computer, apply a PIN number to it, and it authenticates you. That gives you the multi-factor of what you have, the PIV card, and what you know, the PIN number. It could also be something as simple as a mobile phone application that sends you a PIN number when you try to log into a web application. We actually implement some of that stuff for our customers where they have, for instance, a banking application that requires a multi-factor plug-in to it to meet something like an NCUA control or an FFIEC control. And so we help them by implementing a security control that overcomes that objectives for them. And once that's designed, you have to think about, is this going to be measurable and produce the sort of results that we're looking for, tied to the strategy, tied to the objectives, and tied kind of to the overall business objective that we're trying to accomplish here. Once you've done that, then you can actually go and do the work of implementation. Build the actual security control. Maybe you have to buy some technology to do it. You almost certainly have to write a process checklist, and not just the checklist to implement it, but make sure that checklist also includes, here's what we're going to measure whether or not this works, and here's how. And all that stuff is part of the process architecture, and there's a whole body of work out on the internet with respect to process engineering, some frameworks that are of use for you if you're interested in process engineering at a really kind of granular level. COBIT is a very good one, and ITIL are also good from a process engineering standpoint. But that will help you with that do component and making sure that we've implemented what we actually designed. Oftentimes I see process that doesn't actually address the strategy or the concept. It's a process, sure, but if it's not tied back to what it is that we design and what we're trying to get out of it, it's less likely to actually be successful. And then of course, once we've implemented it, we've actually got to review and check and make sure that it's actually doing what we expect it to do. And again, that's where that management and measurement comes from. And first off, ensuring that the process is being followed. That's something that a lot of people often forget. We write a process and we just assume people are going to go and do it. without including like the checks and balances in there to make sure that there's kind of no way around it. They have to follow the process. And without that, you risk, kind of a, back channel or outside of the process sort of scenarios where things should have been done correctly, but they weren't. And since there was no oversight, it's not really possible to identify that. And of course, again, the measurement stuff. I'm going to keep on harping on measurements because if you're not taking measurements on your process, then you're really not doing the continuous improvement stuff. And you're basically assuming that you did it perfectly correct the first time you built that process. And I think that's a dangerous assumption to make. And that review process should feed right back into design, because if you learn something from that iteration that the process needs to change, you not only do you don't just short circuit that and go back to changing the process. You got to go back to the design phase and think about how can, in light of the objectives, in light of the strategy, and in light of what we've learned, how can we re-engineer this process so that we can go and implement the right thing next time. And so it's always important to continue to do that. So that's designing and implementing security controls. Now, security testing is what we're talking about. How can we ensure that the controls we've implemented are doing what we're expecting them to do, and not just the controls that we're implementing, but also the environment as a whole. Things like, again, vulnerability assessment is probably the ideal example for this. So vulnerability assessment, first off, what you need to do is install sensors. And think about from a strategic objective standpoint, if the objective for a vulnerability assessment is to identify vulnerabilities across your environment, and where you put those sensors is going to be really important, right? So it's very important to think about the objective for that particular thing you're testing when you actually do the design. Because for vulnerability assessment specifically, where you put like a vulnerability scanning appliance is going to be critical to ensure that you're able to see every device in the environment, or for instance, an IDS, that you're able to inspect all the traffic that needs to be inspected. Once you've done that, then you can allow the tool to do its job, which is that automated search. And that automated search, in some cases, it may not be truly automated. There may be some human interaction required, but the tool that you're implementing needs to do its job. That's what you've purchased it for. That's why you've designed where it's going to go correctly, and it's going to actually go and do its thing. So it's going to perform that assessment, and then you're going to collect the results. You're going to have to put some human analysis into them. You're going to triage the results. And triage, for those who aren't familiar with the term, is really how you're going to identify a false positive versus an actual legitimate issue that's got to be fixed. And you certainly want to make sure that you're not chasing your tail with a bunch of false positives. And so it's really important to do that step right. I've seen a lot of vulnerability assessments that actually paint a much worse picture than is reality because nobody's done a true false positive analysis. A good way to do that, this is perhaps a belt and suspenders approach, but I often see multiple different types of vulnerability assessment tools being used, and at least two to compare results against one another. That kind of doubles the work at the installation and the searching, but it reduces the workload at that triage and analysis component of it. Of course, once you've identified the incidents, the issues that have to be fixed, you got to prioritize how it is you're going to do the fixing. And of course, you want to fix the worst things first. And so, if you have critical vulnerabilities, you address those first, and you can measure how well you're doing that by how quickly it takes, or how long it takes for your system administrator team to actually go and implement the patches or lock down the systems that are vulnerable. But you want to make sure that you're measuring that. That's a really important thing to measure, is how quickly can we actually fix issues that we're identifying via the security testing process. What you might often find is that there's low-hanging fruit. That it might be that you've got some high severity vulnerabilities, maybe a handful of them that are impacting something like a legacy application, but you have 1,000 moderate risk vulnerabilities that are easily patched by downloading like a Microsoft hotfix. So in that case, I might recommend you take the path of least resistance and address the 1,000 moderate vulnerabilities before the handful of high vulnerabilities. What you might do in that case is think about what sort of countermeasure can we put in place to minimize the risk of that vulnerability being exploited. And again, that's something where there's a process involved of identifying risk, identifying what controls are in place, identifying what countermeasures exist, and then measuring how well those countermeasures might work at actually reducing the risk that you're looking at. But the recommendation is always to fix the worst problem first, and then report on the progress. Management needs to know how well the security controls are working. Management needs to know how quickly their teams are reacting to risks, because that information is going to help them make decisions about resources. So if you're a CISO, for instance, or if you're a security administrator, and you're constantly petitioning to your boss that you need resources, and I hear this all the time, we're under-resourced, we're understaffed, we don't have the right budget. If you're not able to produce a metric for your boss that says, if I had this extra resource, if we had this extra budget, I'd be able to reduce the amount of time it takes me to fix these problems to this, then you're going to have a much harder time petitioning for budget. And I know when I get asked for increased budgets, I'm always asking for the business case. What am I going to get out of this? The only way that you can demonstrate that to an executive is by showing them those metrics and measurements. And so make sure you're tracking that stuff. Your vulnerability assessment tools, almost all of them include things like trend lines, and if they don't, you can export that stuff out to Excel and do some charts and do some analysis against the results. But you've got to make sure you track that. It's also an opportunity for you to put a feather in your cap and say, hey, look at how well we did last quarter with respect to reducing vulnerabilities and improving the security of the organization as a whole. I probably deserve some recognition for that. Isn't an approach you might take with your senior leadership. And a lot of times that's going to be meaningful to them. Security, as everybody knows, is super high on the priority list for boardrooms today. And if you can demonstrate to your board or to the CAO or to the executive leadership team that actually we do have a pretty good security program, and here's how it works, and here's how well we're doing via some metrics and measurements and reporting of progress, that's going to go a very long way to showing that you've thought through kind of the business problem of cybersecurity in addition to just the technology problem of it. But again, no matter how well you do, no matter how good your security controls are, and no matter how secure your system is, it truly is a matter of when and not if with respect to security incident handling. There's going to be some period of time at some point in the future. Hopefully for you guys, it's very far down the future, and I hope it never happens to you. But it's very, very likely that at some point you're going to have a security incident that you're going to have to address. And the amount of time it takes you to do this is really what separates a very functional security program from a non-functional one. Some scary statistics here include things like average time it takes to actually detect the incident is something like 7 months. And so that is an ineffective security program that's probably not being measured, but probably got some very broken process with some tools that are misconfigured because the configuration process wasn't followed, or perhaps some changes were introduced to the environment without a change control process being followed, and that limited the security operations team's ability to detect and follow their process. But one way or another, the security incident handling process, and what you're looking at the screen right now, is based on the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, their guidance, which is contained in special publication 861. So if you're interested, you can go out and look at NIST's website to find more information about good incident handling procedures. But this is our internal incident handling procedure that we use to address incidents we detect in our Security Operations Center. And again, it's based on that government NIST guidance. First off, you got to prepare, and part of that preparation is implementing the right security controls. So the stuff we talked about earlier with security control design and implementation, process implementation, process engineering, that's all that preparation stuff. Making sure that your incident response plan is correct and has been thought through with respect to communications matrix and stakeholders and stuff like that. That's all preparation. Making sure you got the right policies. That people they know what sort of rules of behavior they're supposed to follow. That who needs to be notified if an incident actually occurs. All that stuff is that preparation process. The detection and analysis phase is, if you remember earlier when we talked about the prevention, detection, containment, and response, that's what we're talking about, detection. So looking at things like system logs, or pulling information into your SIM from all of your different security appliances and from your endpoints and databases, things like that, and matching that against threat intelligence so that you can actually detect an incident. There's a very small subset of the world that can truly actually detect an incident themselves. Something like 19% of organizations are able to self-detect. 81% of organizations they rely upon an external party to do that detection component for them. And in many cases, that ends up being the FBI. You don't want to find yourself in that sort of domain. So that's all based upon how well you're prepared and how good your detection processes are. And then again, how well your triage process is for identifying what's a legitimate security incident and what's a false positive. But if that process is working, then you're going to be able to detect incidents and move into that containment, eradication, and recovery component of this process. And that in and of itself is a process. It's totally reliant upon you having done a good job with secure architecture, having it followed a good and rigorous security control design process, so that containment is much more simplified, and that eradication and recovery are much more simplified. I mean, an eradication process probably relies upon many different security controls in your environment. It's probably going to rely upon the security controls at your network level to perhaps quarantine infected device, or perhaps just shut it off from the network, kill a port on your switch, for instance. And then a process for an individual from your Security Operations Center team going and retrieving that device and bringing it back to a controlled environment, or perhaps on a physically air-gapped segment of your network, you can actually turn it back on and see what that device is going to do. If you're doing some malware reverse engineering or something like that, or simply just going and cleaning the malware off if it's a malware sort of incident via your antivirus or anti-malware tools. But there are processes that should be kind of laid out in your incident response procedure to tell you exactly what you're supposed to do in various different scenarios. And then that kind of feeds back into detection, and that's an important loop to notice there, because what you learn from that containment, eradication, and recovery phase should be fed back into detection. So that, for instance, if you identify some new piece of malware or a new sort of behavior that you've observed for the first time, you should be able to bake that into your detection tool so that you can observe that much more quickly next time and be that much better. And again, so that second iteration of that loop is more effective and more efficient than the first iteration. But once you actually have done that eradication and recovery, then there's all that after-action activity that needs to take place. And that usually forms or comes in the form of things like user training. I think one of the most common incidents that we see is successful phishing attacks. And that's something which is preventable via technology and also via security awareness training. You know, when I see somebody being successfully phished, I think, all right, well, hopefully after you went through that pain, you felt the pain of that actually occurring. Maybe you got crypto locked or something like that. You took the time to actually do the after-action activity and train the person and the rest of your staff on what went wrong and what they should have done so that next time it doesn't happen. And that flows directly back into preparation. And there are other things that would be included in that after-action activity, things like bolstering security controls or perhaps implementing a new security control to overcome an issue that you hadn't previously identified. Like I said, our security mantra is nobody's perfect, and there's always going to be ways to improve, and continuous improvement is just a key part of security program design and process execution. And again, part of that really comes in the form of security control and posture reviews. So, we talked at length about vulnerability assessments earlier, but there are many different types of vulnerability assessments that you should be thinking about as you look at the effectiveness of your security program as a whole. First off, you got to take a look at what your outside, or how you look from the outside, your external assessment. A penetration test is probably what you're most familiar with from that regard. What's a bad guy out on the internet I'm going to be able to do just by knowing my IP address, or even if they don't know my IP address, just by firing off a Metasploit or some other automated tool that's going to go out and look for vulnerable IP addresses, regardless of whether or not they know who I am or not. And actually, the vast majority of attacks really are described by that. They're not necessarily specifically targeting you. Maybe you are a very high-profile company, and there are people targeting organizations like that, but the vast majority of the time, it's simply a target of opportunity. A vulnerability exists in your external interface that just happens to get exploited. 70% of the world's compromises actually occur by that are simply just based upon the fact that you have a vulnerability that's a known vulnerability, that patches exist, that exploits exist, and you haven't patched it yet. And if you're not doing that external assessment from the internet in, then you're leaving yourself at significant risk for some internet attacker to take advantage of that stuff. The internal assessment's very, very similar to that, except instead of just looking from the outside in, you're looking from the inside out, and also at the kind of the chewy center of your environment. I see a lot of times that organizations put a lot of effort into hardening things like their firewalls, but have very, very lax internal controls around access across different network segments and things like that. And so a vulnerability assessment from an internal perspective isn't just firing off Nessus against your IP addresses. It's looking at your security architecture. It's looking at your network design and ensuring that you've got the right checks and balances in place, the right choke points for traffic so that you can do segmentation, you can do monitoring of lateral movement inside the network. All that goes into an internal assessment and making sure that you're secure, not just from, again, a vulnerability perspective, but that your architecture actually supports security. That's actually something a lot of people forget to do. They'll do regular vulnerability assessments because there's a compliance check that they've got to check the box on, but they're not doing a good security architecture assessment, which is a key component of it too. Social engineering, of course, I mentioned phishing earlier. If you're not doing phishing assessments today, you are at significant risk. You need to know how susceptible your employees are to being phished, because I promise you people are trying to phish them every single day of the week. And those human vulnerabilities are often your weakest links. So if you're not currently doing phishing assessments against your organization regularly, make sure you start soon. There are some platforms out there that you use to do that, one which we offer and a professional service that we offer around that. One thing I heard recently, which I thought was a clever idea, was the security team sent an email out to their user base saying, hey folks, we're going to have a live phishing assessment. It's a contest, and whoever successfully identifies the phishing email wins $100. And then they just simply never did the actual phishing assessment. So basically everybody was on guard watching for phishing emails and kind of just raised their level of awareness so that when the actual, somebody actually was trying to phish them, they would be more prone to notice it. So I thought that was a clever idea. So additionally, so we talked about external, internal, social. Wireless is also an extremely important one to be thinking about. If you don't have good internal controls around what can be plugged into your network, and I see this all the time, one of your employees could install a wireless access point on your network without you knowing it. And that's very, very common. And what that does is, especially if they don't configure it correctly or if they just leave it at default, that's going to open up a side channel into your environment that anybody in your parking lot could attach to your network without you having any idea that that's actually occurring. And that circumvents all those security controls that you spent all that time and all that money actually implementing. So if you're not doing good wireless assessments, and there's specific processes for this too, we used to call it war driving, where you drive around looking for vulnerable wireless networks or open wireless networks and just seeing what you could do. And people do that in office parks too. They'll walk around with a laptop or with their phone, looking for open wireless networks or looking for wireless networks that are secured by kind of weak protocols like wireless equivalent privacy or WEP and other things like that. And if you're not looking for vulnerabilities in your own wireless infrastructure, then again you're going to be at risk. And that's a continuous process too. That's not something and none of these are really kind of one-time things. These are things you need to do regularly, and again you need to learn from and implement fixes based on what you're finding. Another one with wireless is a lot of times organizations who have clients that visit them will have a guest network that's a wireless network that either is unsecured or has a weak password. And you usually do have to provide some level of internet access to a guest, especially if it's a client or business partner. But your wireless network should be architected in a way so that those individuals that attach to that network can only get to the internet. They can't get to your internal environment. Because that opens up significant risk to somebody whose system is not secured to your standards by the configuration hardening process that you defined and you implemented in your own network. They don't necessarily have that. So if they're attaching to your network, they're introducing unknown risks. And the way that your network, your wireless network is architected should support that your control so that they don't have access to your internal environment without going through that same kind of control assessment. So that's an important aspect of that too. The physical security assessment, again, this is another process that needs to be followed regularly. We usually see this coming as a component of a good penetration test or an enterprise risk assessment, which we recommend people do at least once a year. Probably want to do it more frequently than that if you're in a kind of a high security environment, you're processing sensitive data. And that's going to really be walking around the environment, making sure that I can't just go and shoulder surf somebody's password, or their password's not written down on a Post-it note under their desktop or under their keyboard, something like that. And then also making sure that the facilities where your information processing takes place are actually secured. They're not just in an unlocked closet with a fire nozzle right above your server farm, so that if there was a fire and the alarm went off and the sprinklers went off, all of a sudden you're completely out of business. You'd be surprised. It sounds like common sense, but I've seen that more often than I'd care to admit. So it's something that's got to be done regularly as well. And again, where you see deficiencies, you got to learn from that, and you got to make sure that people are in that after-action activity section. You're taking those lessons learned and you're implementing controls to either fix those problems or train people to make sure that they're more prepared the next time around. And then last one we're going to talk about here is application and database. So this is real similar to the internal assessment, but it's more granularly focused on applications and databases. Applications are a lot of times kind of the front end to very sensitive data. And if you're not doing good application scanning via something that does web app scanning, and there are several out there, you should be doing that regularly, especially if you have any kind of financial data. If you are in an environment where you process payment cards and you're PCI compliant, or you should be PCI compliant, you have to be doing application scanning. You have to be doing database scanning, making sure things like software flaws are being patched, or just simply best practices have been followed, and that again. So tying it back to process, that something like the secure software development lifecycle has been actually followed, and that people are implementing fixes and learning again from from assessments that were being done, or that your databases were configured according to your configuration hardening standard process. That's, again, really important to do so that we can measure how successful we are with these different controls we're implementing. All about measurements. So when you think about process, again, there's several different key characteristics we want you to leave this thinking about. Is it repeatable? Am I going to be able to do this the same way every single time? Is it something that I can hand off to another individual? Let's say a new employee comes in and I've got to get them up to speed very quickly. If I can hand somebody a process that's understandable, legible, and repeatable, it's going to be much shorter learning curve to get that person onboarded within your environment. And again, you're going to be operating in a known good state at that point because you know that the process is being followed. People are doing it the same way every single time, and you're not introducing unknown risks into your environment. That's all about repeatability. Is it scalable? Is it something that is going to grow with us? Is it something that is going to address not just today's problem, but the problem tomorrow and perhaps next year? And that also ties into that sustainability aspect of it too. Is it something that's going to stand the test of time? Is it going to kind of roll with the punches? Is it something that is going to be flexible enough to address different kinds of problems in the same sort of domain? Again, a good example for that is an incident handling process. There's many different kinds of incidents, and your incident handling process should be able to account for all of them. So it shouldn't necessarily be too granularly specific, or if it is, it should be scenario-based and address many different scenarios. And then, of course, again, is it measurable? Is it something I can look at and say, these are the key performance indicators of whether or not this process is successful, and this is what I need to measure, and this is how frequently I'm going to measure it, and this is how I'm going to report that we're being successful. And then, the one that's not written up here on the screen is that lessons learned. Are we able to take those measurements and tie it back into a process of continuous improvement? And if you can do that, if you can do all these things, you can say yes to every one of these questions, then you've probably designed a very effective process. And your environment's going to be very efficient, and your management's going to be super happy to see the results that are coming out of your measures, because you're going to be able to show off that even if you're not perfect today, you're trending in the right direction, and the resources that the organization is putting towards security are producing the results they want. And that's really the key aspect of it. So with all that said, I'm going to open the floor to some questions. Okay, so question one, who needs to be responsible for creating and implementing a process in the organization? So that's a good question. So who owns process engineering? The answer to that, well, first off, it depends, and it depends upon what the process is. But the responsible party should be the system owner, or the owner of the information that's being protected. And that's kind of who's ultimately accountable for the security control that might be implemented protecting a particular piece of information. But the responsible party of who's designing and implementing that, it's usually a steering committee or a group of stakeholders that have something to do with the protection of that information. So an example I'll give you, let's take a vulnerability assessment process. So who's responsible for that, or accountable? I would say the accountable party is probably the senior executive who has to sign off on risk for the organization. And then who's responsible for implementing or for designing the process is usually going to be the team of people that are supported by the information systems that are being scanned. So perhaps accounting has something to say in how a vulnerability assessment process is done, because maybe there's a particular time of the day or the week or the quarter that that scanning is going to be very disruptive to them, and so that should be baked into the process. Similarly, IT is going to necessarily be a part of that. Security is obviously going to be a part of that as well. But each of those stakeholders that could be impacted by that process needs to have some say in how it's architected, how it's implemented, and how it's executed. So again, it kind of depends, but usually it's going to be a committee of people that are responsible for it. Other questions? Okay, one other question. Okay, so how does working with an MSSP like TruShield help the process? So our MSSP offering, I think, has a lot of the repeatability, sustainability, measurability, and scalability just baked right into it. We spent a long time working on that to make our environment sustainable and scalable and all that sort of stuff, so that we can, first off, eat our own dog food. What we're telling you to do, we're doing. And then additionally, make it so that our operation is efficient, and we can simply provide you back things like ROI analysis and measures and metrics of how effective the security program actually is. There's also an aspect of not just the MSSP side, but if an organization that's not an MSSP subscriber is looking for help for process engineering, then our professional services side of the house will get involved and work through that whole control design thing that we talked about with respect to, what's the strategic objective, what's the business need that we're trying to support, and then how can we architect a control or architect a process that's going to be able to be repeatable, measurable, scalable, and sustainable. And that's something that we've got a lot of experience helping with. Other questions? Okay, so I don't see any other questions, so I just, again, thank you guys for attending today. I would please invite you to come to our security control webinar next month, where we're going to talk specifically about controls. We talked about the process of designing controls today. We're going to talk about what some of those controls are next time around. And again, if you missed any of the preceding webinars, take a look at our resources page, and you can keep up with what it is that we're talking about with security program design and development. So again, thanks, folks. If you have more questions, feel free to reach out to us either at the phone number or on our website, and I look forward to hearing from you next time.